The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Valdoria's royal palace like secrets whispered in shadows. King Charles Auguste stood at the massive windows of his private study, watching the sun struggle through gray clouds that seemed to mirror the storm gathering in his heart. At 68, he carried himself with the practiced dignity of a man born to rule, yet today his shoulders bore a weight that had nothing to do with the crown jewels locked away in the tower vault. The mahogany desk behind him held a manila envelope that had arrived 3 hours ago, delivered by his most trusted security chief, with trembling hands and eyes that couldn't quite meet the royal gaze. Charles had not yet opened it, though he suspected its contents would change everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping peacefully in the royal chambers above. Queen Consort Isabella had entered his life like spring after a brutal winter. 20 years younger, with Mediterranean warmth that melted the formal protocols he'd been raised to cherish, she had transformed not just his heart, but the entire atmosphere of the palace. The staff adored her charitable work, the people loved her genuine smile during public appearances, and Charles had believed himself the luckiest king in the world to have found love so late in life. But love, as his grandmother had once warned him, could be the most dangerous advisor a ruler could trust. The envelope crackled as he finally reached for it, breaking the wax seal that bore the insignia of Valdoria's secret intelligence service. Inside, a collection of photographs and documents painted a picture so devastating that Charles felt his world shift on its axis. There was Isabella, elegant in a navy suit he remembered buying for her birthday, sitting across from Heinrich Volkov, the notorious arms dealer who'd been blacklisted by every civilized nation. The timestamp showed last Tuesday, when she'd told Charles she was visiting children's hospitals. Another photo showed her accepting a briefcase from Viktor Petrov, a man Charles recognized as a representative of Moldavian separatists who'd been threatening Valdoria's eastern borders for months. The documents detailed bank transfers, coded communications, and, worst of all, copies of classified defense strategies that should have been known only to Charles and his most senior military advisors. His wife, the woman who shared his bed and his deepest fears about ruling a modern kingdom in turbulent times, had been selling state secrets to enemies of the realm. Charles sank into his leather chair, the weight of 40 years waiting to be king suddenly, seeming insignificant compared to this moment. He had ascended to the throne only 3 years ago after his mother's peaceful death, and had spent those years trying to modernize Valdoria while respecting its ancient traditions. Isabella had seemed to support every initiative, from educational reform to environmental protection programs. Had it all been an elaborate performance? A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Your Majesty," came the voice of Thomas Whitmore, his private secretary and one of the few people in the palace he trusted completely. "Prince William has arrived for your morning briefing." Prince William, his eldest son and heir apparent, entered with the confident stride of a man who'd spent 35 years preparing for kingship. Tall and lean like his father, with his mother's intelligent blue eyes, William had always been the responsible one among Charles's 3 children. While his younger siblings pursued artistic endeavors and charity work around the globe, William had devoted himself to understanding statecraft, military strategy, and the delicate balance of modern constitutional monarchy. "Father, you look terrible," William said with the bluntness that came from royal privilege and genuine concern. "Thomas mentioned some urgent intelligence matter?" Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting how his son's trained eye immediately cataloged the scattered documents. William had served 5 years in Valdoria's special forces before taking on full-time royal duties, and his military bearing never quite disappeared even in civilian clothes. "Son, what I'm about to tell you must not leave this room until we decide how to proceed." Charles's voice carried the formal tone he used for matters of state, but William caught the underlying tremor of personal anguish. "It concerns Isabella." As Charles outlined the intelligence findings, he watched his son's expression shift from confusion to shock to carefully controlled anger. William had always maintained polite distance from his stepmother, neither embracing her warmly nor showing any particular hostility. Isabella had joined the family when William was already 28 and established in his own life, making their relationship cordial but not particularly close. "How long has this been going on?" William asked, his voice steady despite the implications racing through his mind. "The intelligence suggests at least 8 months, possibly longer." Charles stood and moved to the window again, unable to bear the look of sympathy in his son's eyes. "They have recorded conversations, photographic evidence, financial records." It's comprehensive and, I'm afraid, irrefutable. William studied the documents with the methodical approach he'd learned in military intelligence training. The evidence was indeed damning, but his mind immediately jumped to the larger implications. Father, if this becomes public knowledge, it won't just destroy Isabella. The monarchy itself could be at risk. The observation hit Charles like a physical blow. Valdoria's constitutional monarchy had survived 2 world wars, 3 economic depressions, and the social upheavals of the past century by maintaining the people's trust and respect. A scandal involving treasonous activity by the Queen Consort could trigger Republican movements that had been quietly gaining strength in recent years. The intelligence chief is waiting for instructions, Charles said. They've contained the investigation to a small team, but foreign intelligence services may already have pieces of this puzzle. We may not have much time before this becomes impossible to contain. William moved to stand beside his father at the window, both men looking out at the capital city of Valenhall spreading below them. Somewhere in those medieval streets and modern neighborhoods lived 8 million Valdorians who trusted their royal family to protect their interests and uphold their values. The weight of that responsibility had never felt heavier. What does your heart tell you to do? William asked quietly. Charles was quiet for a long moment, remembering Isabella's laugh at last week's state dinner, the way she'd held his hand during his mother's funeral, the genuine tears in her eyes when they'd visited tsunami victims last year. My heart tells me there must be some explanation, some misunderstanding, that the woman I love could not possibly have betrayed everything I hold sacred. And your duty as king? My duty as king demands that I protect Valdoria above all else, even above my personal happiness. The words felt like glass in his throat. If Isabella is guilty of treason, she must face the consequences, regardless of my feelings. They stood in silence as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the study. In those shadows, both men could see the outline of decisions that would reshape their family and their kingdom forever. There's something else, Charles said, reaching for a second envelope he'd been avoiding. The intelligence service has prepared contingency recommendations. They believe the only way to preserve the monarchy's credibility is for me to abdicate immediately after dealing with Isabella's treason. A clean break, they call it. New king, new beginning, public faith restored. William felt the blood drain from his face. He'd always known he would one day be king, but had assumed it would be decades in the future when his father chose to retire or passed away naturally. The thought of ascending the throne under such circumstances, amid scandal and betrayal, filled him with dread. They want you to abdicate. They believe it's the only way to save the institution of the monarchy itself. Charles turned to face his son directly. William, I need you to understand something. If I choose this path, you'll be thrust onto the throne during one of the most challenging periods in our nation's modern history. The political opposition will use this scandal to attack the entire system of constitutional monarchy. Foreign enemies will see us as weakened and vulnerable. And, personally, you'll be scrutinized as you've never been before. William straightened his shoulders, and, for a moment Charles saw not his son but the future King William V of Valdoria. If the monarchy needs me to serve, then I'll serve. But, Father, are you certain abdication is the right choice? Won't it look like you're running from responsibility? Perhaps. Or perhaps it will be seen as taking the ultimate responsibility by ensuring the crown isn't tainted by my personal failures. Charles moved to his desk and picked up a photograph of Isabella from their wedding day, her smile radiant as she accepted the simple gold band that had belonged to Charles's grandmother. I chose to marry her despite warnings from advisors who thought the age difference and her lack of noble birth made her unsuitable. I insisted on bringing her into the heart of our government, giving her access to information that should have been more carefully protected. If she's betrayed that trust, the failure is ultimately mine. The study door opened after a discreet knock, and Thomas Whitmore entered with the careful expression of a man bearing unwelcome news. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but there's been a development. The intelligence service reports that foreign media outlets are beginning to ask questions about Queen Consort Isabella's recent activities. They may have received leaked information. Charles felt his last hopes for a quiet, private resolution crumble. How much time do we have? Perhaps 48 hours before something breaks publicly, sir. Possibly less. William stepped forward. Father, we need to make decisions quickly. But, first, shouldn't we confront Isabella directly? Give her a chance to explain herself before we assume the worst. Charles considered this, torn between his desire to believe in his wife's innocence and his responsibility to protect the kingdom from potentially explosive revelations. You're right. She deserves to know what we've discovered and to provide her side of the story. But, William, I want you present during that conversation. If I'm going to abdicate and place this burden on your shoulders, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. When do we speak with her? This afternoon. I'll ask her to join us for tea in the private dining room, somewhere comfortable where she won't feel immediately defensive. Charles paused, looking once more at their wedding photograph. Whatever she tells us, whatever explanation she offers, we must be prepared for the possibility that the woman I married and the person who committed these acts of treason are the same individual. As the morning progressed, both men went through the motions of their regular duties while their minds raced with preparations for the most important conversation of their lives. Charles met with cabinet ministers, signed routine legislation, and reviewed diplomatic correspondence, all while the evidence of his wife's betrayal burned in his consciousness like a brand. William conducted his scheduled review of infrastructure projects and met with university students participating in the Crown's Leadership Development Program, but found himself studying their young faces and wondering what kind of kingdom he might soon inherit. These students represented Valdoria's future, and their faith in the monarchy could be shattered by the decisions made in the coming hours. At 2 o'clock, as palace staff prepared the private dining room with Isabella's favorite porcelain tea service and the raspberry scones she'd grown to love during her time in Valdoria, Charles stood before his bedroom mirror adjusting his tie with unsteady hands. In 3 years of marriage, he'd never hidden anything significant from Isabella. The irony that she had apparently been concealing massive deceptions from him was not lost on him. A light knock on the connecting door to Isabella's chambers made his heart race. "Charles, Thomas said you wanted to see me for tea." Isabella entered wearing a simple blue dress that complemented her dark hair, her smile warm and genuine as always. Looking at her now, Charles found it almost impossible to reconcile this woman with the person in the intelligence photographs. How could someone so naturally affectionate, so seemingly devoted to their shared life, have been living such an elaborate lie? "Yes, my dear. William will be joining us as well. We have some matters to discuss." Something in his tone made her pause, her intuitive nature picking up on the undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite hide. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled." For a moment, Charles almost wavered, almost decided to dismiss the intelligence reports as some terrible mistake and trust in the love that had sustained him through the most challenging years of his life. But the weight of the crown, the responsibility to 8 million citizens, and the oath he'd sworn to protect and serve his kingdom above all else kept him on course. "Let's go down to tea, Isabella. We'll discuss everything there." As they walked through the familiar halls of the palace they'd shared for 3 years, Charles found himself memorizing details he'd taken for granted. The way Isabella unconsciously straightened pictures that had shifted slightly on the walls, her habit of greeting staff members by name and asking about their families, the comfortable silence that had always existed between them. In a few hours, all of this might be nothing but memory. The private dining room felt smaller than usual with 3 people seated around the intimate table where Charles and Isabella had shared countless meals and conversations. William sat with the formal posture of a man prepared for unpleasant duty, while Isabella looked between father and son with growing confusion and concern. "Isabella," Charles began, his voice carefully controlled, "we've received some very serious information that concerns your activities over the past several months. I want to give you an opportunity to explain before we draw any conclusions." The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable to Charles, who'd learned to read her moods over 3 years of marriage. The warm openness in her eyes flickered and was replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. In that instant, he knew that whatever explanations she might offer, the basic facts of the intelligence report were true. "What kind of information?" she asked, but her voice had lost its natural warmth. William reached into his briefcase and withdrew the photographs, placing them on the table where Isabella could see them clearly. Her face went pale as she recognized the images of herself with Heinrich Volkov and Viktor Petrov, but she didn't immediately speak or deny what was obvious. "Isabella," Charles said gently, "these photographs show you meeting with known enemies of Valdoria. The intelligence service has evidence of financial transactions and information exchanges that constitute treason against the crown and the people of this kingdom. I need you to help me understand how this is possible." For a long moment, The only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Isabella stared at the photographs, and Charles could almost see her mind working through possible explanations, denials, or justifications. When she finally looked up, her expression held a complexity of emotions that broke his heart: guilt, defiance, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. "Charles," she said quietly, "there are things about my life before we met that you never knew. Things I hoped you would never need to know." The admission hit both men like a physical blow, confirming their worst fears while opening the door to revelations that might be even more devastating than they'd imagined. Whatever Isabella was about to reveal would determine not just her fate, but the future of the monarchy itself. The silence in the private dining room stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the distant sound of palace staff going about their daily routines, unaware that the foundation of their world was cracking apart. Isabella's admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything Charles had built during his brief reign. "Tell us," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. The formal distance he was trying to maintain crumbled as the man behind the crown spoke directly to the woman he believed he knew completely. "Tell us everything." Isabella stood and moved to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, her silhouette backlit by afternoon sunlight that seemed to emphasize how she'd always been slightly apart from their world, beautiful, but somehow separate. When she turned back to face them, her expression held a composure that chilled Charles more than tears or hysteria would have. "My real name is Isabella Valdez, but before I became your wife, I was Isabella Marquez. I worked for the Moldavian intelligence service for 12 years before I ever set foot in Valdoria." Her voice was steady, professionally calm, as if she were delivering a briefing rather than confessing treason to her husband. "I was assigned to establish a relationship with you 18 months before we actually met." William felt his stomach drop as the full scope of the deception became clear. "You're telling us that your entire relationship with my father was a professional assignment? That none of it was real?" Isabella's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment Charles glimpsed the woman he thought he'd married. "No, that's not. It became real. Charles, you have to believe that what grew between us was genuine, even if it didn't start that way. But you continued to work for foreign intelligence while married to the King of Valdoria." William pressed, his military training taking over as he analyzed the security implications. "You had access to state secrets, military planning, diplomatic correspondence. How much information did you pass along?" "Less than they wanted, more than I should have." Isabella returned to her chair, but didn't sit, gripping the back as if it were an anchor. "Charles, when I was first assigned to approach you, I was told it would be a short-term operation. Gather some basic intelligence about Valdoria's defense capabilities and political leanings, then extricate myself cleanly. But when your mother became ill, and it became clear you would soon be king, my handlers saw a much larger opportunity." Charles felt physically sick as puzzle pieces clicked into place. "The charity gala where we met. You weren't there by coincidence. I was there specifically to meet you. My cover was perfect, a successful art dealer from Barcelona with connections to European nobility, passionate about humanitarian causes, sophisticated enough to move in royal circles, but not so prominent that my background would be scrutinized too carefully." Isabella's professional demeanor wavered again. "But, Charles, I need you to understand that falling in love with you wasn't part of the plan. It complicated everything." "How touching," William said dryly, his protective instincts toward his father overriding any sympathy he might have felt for Isabella's emotional conflict. "You fell in love while committing treason. I'm sure that made the betrayal much more meaningful." Isabella's eyes flashed with something approaching anger. "You don't understand the position I was in, William. I wasn't some starry-eyed romantic who stumbled into espionage. I'd been working for Moldavian intelligence since I was 22 years old. I had handlers who knew every detail of my life, who had leverage over my family, who made it very clear what would happen if I failed in my assignments." Charles finally found his voice, though it sounded hollow to his own ears. "What kind of leverage?" "My younger brother Miguel was arrested on fabricated drug charges 3 months before I was assigned to approach you. My handlers made it clear that his fate depended on my successful completion of my mission." Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she continued. "When I tried to extract myself after we got married, when I told them I wanted out of intelligence work completely, they reminded me that Miguel was still in their custody. And, by then, they had even more leverage." "What additional leverage?" William asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "Evidence of my true identity and my activities in Valdoria. They could expose everything at any time, destroying not just me but Charles's reputation and the monarchy's credibility. They own me completely. Isabella sat down heavily, her professional composure finally cracking. Every month, they demanded more information. Defense briefings, diplomatic communications, details about royal family security arrangements. I tried to give them older intelligence, outdated information, anything to satisfy them without causing real damage. But they always knew when I was holding back. Charles stared at his wife, trying to reconcile the woman he'd shared his deepest fears and hopes with, and this trained intelligence operative who'd been manipulating him from their first conversation. The children's hospital visits. The charity work. Was any of it real? All of it was real, Charles. Every moment we spent together when we weren't discussing state business. Every conversation about the future of Valdoria. Every night you held me when you were worried about living up to your mother's legacy. All of that was genuine. Isabella's voice broke slightly. But whenever you shared classified information, whenever you asked my opinion on military matters or diplomatic strategies, I was trapped between my love for you and my fear for my brother's safety. William pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. We need to verify her story about the brother. If he exists and is actually in Moldavian custody, it changes the legal and political implications significantly. His name is Miguel Marquez, and he's been held at Moldavian state prison outside of Branislav for nearly 4 years now, Isabella said quietly. I haven't been allowed to communicate with him, but my handlers send me photographs occasionally to remind me what's at stake. The cruel efficiency of the operation impressed William despite his anger. The Moldavian intelligence service had created the perfect asset, someone with legitimate emotional investment in her cover identity, but unbreakable chains binding her to her handlers. Isabella couldn't fully embrace her life as queen consort because she was always aware of her brother's fate, but she couldn't abandon her mission without destroying everything she'd come to care about in Valdoria. The recent escalation in intelligence demands, Charles said, beginning to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. It coincided with the border tensions with Moldavian separatists. They were planning something big, Charles. The intelligence I was providing about Valdoria's eastern defense preparations, the locations of supply depots, the rotation schedules for border patrols, it wasn't just routine intelligence gathering. They were building detailed operational knowledge for what I believe was going to be a coordinated assault on our border positions. William looked up sharply from his phone. You're telling us that Moldavia was using intelligence you provided to plan an actual military attack on Valdorian territory? I think so, yes. The questions became very specific about troop movements, ammunition supplies, communication equipment. My handler stopped asking about political intelligence and focused entirely on military vulnerabilities. Isabella looked directly at Charles. That's when I realized I had to find a way out, even if it meant exposing everything. I couldn't be responsible for Valdorian soldiers dying because of information I provided. So you tried to contact our intelligence services? I tried to figure out how to approach them without immediately being arrested for treason. But before I could make contact, Heinrich Volkov reached out to me directly. Isabella's voice took on a note of urgency. He said he had information about a planned attack on Valdoria and wanted to trade that information for asylum and protection for my brother. Charles felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Volkov was trying to help you defect? He was trying to help himself, but yes, he offered to arrange my brother's extraction from Moldavian custody in exchange for everything I knew about their intelligence operations and their plans for Valdoria. The photographs your intelligence service captured show me meeting with him to discuss the details of his offer. William was already dialing a secure number on his phone. We need to verify this immediately. If Volkov was actually trying to facilitate a defection rather than recruit an additional asset, it changes everything about how we handle this situation. As William stepped away to speak with intelligence contacts, Charles found himself alone with Isabella for the first time since the devastating revelations began. Looking at her now, he could see traces of the professional operative she'd once been. The careful way she held herself, the analytical approach to explaining her circumstances, the emotional distance she maintained even while confessing deeply personal information. Isabella, he said quietly, I need to ask you directly. During our marriage, during the moments when we were completely alone together, was any of your affection genuine? Or was I simply another assignment you had to complete successfully? The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an unbridgeable chasm. Charles realized that her answer might determine not just whether he could forgive her, but whether he could maintain faith in his own judgment and ability to read people, qualities essential for a king. Charles, I know you have no reason to believe me now, but I need you to understand something. When I was first assigned to approach you, I was told you were a privileged, somewhat dim aristocrat who'd inherited power without earning it. Someone who would be easy to manipulate and unlikely to notice if information went missing from his private study. And instead I found a man who'd spent 40 years preparing for the most difficult job in the world, who cared more about his people's welfare than his own comfort, who stayed awake at night worrying about decisions that would affect millions of lives. Isabella's professional mask slipped completely. I found someone I respected before I loved him, and loved before I realized how much my situation was going to hurt him. Charles studied her face, looking for traces of deception or manipulation, but saw only the exhausted honesty of someone who'd been carrying an impossible burden for too long. But you continued to pass information to your handlers, even after you realized you loved me. Because I loved my brother too, and because I was terrified of what exposure would do to you and to Valdoria. Every choice I made seemed to guarantee someone would be hurt. There was no clean way out that wouldn't destroy lives I cared about. William returned from his phone call, his expression grim but thoughtful. I've spoken with our intelligence chief and with contacts at international security services. Heinrich Volkov has been in negotiations with 3 different European governments about potential defection deals. His offer to facilitate your brother's extraction appears to have been genuine, though obviously self-serving. What about the planned attack on our border positions? Charles asked. Moldavian military activity has increased significantly in the past 2 weeks, but it's not clear whether that represents preparation for immediate action or simply increased readiness posture. William sat back down at the table. What is clear is that if Isabella's information is accurate, we have a narrow window to strengthen our defenses before any potential assault. Charles felt the weight of kingship settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. Personal betrayal aside, he now had to consider how to protect Valdoria from immediate military threats while dealing with the political crisis that Isabella's exposure would create. Isabella, I need you to tell me exactly what information you've provided to your handlers over the past 6 months. Everything, no matter how minor it might seem. Our military planners need to understand what intelligence advantages Moldavian forces might have. For the next 2 hours, Isabella provided a detailed debriefing that painted a disturbing picture of how thoroughly Moldavian intelligence had penetrated Valdorian strategic planning. Border patrol schedules, supply depot locations, communication protocols, even personal information about senior military officers. Everything she'd learned through her access to Charles's daily briefings had been systematically transmitted to enemy handlers. The scope of the security breach is massive, William concluded as they finished reviewing Isabella's confessions. Father, this goes beyond questions of personal betrayal or political scandal. Moldavia has operational intelligence that could cripple our defensive capabilities if they choose to act on it. Charles nodded grimly. We'll need to change everything immediately. New patrol schedules, relocated supply points, updated communication codes, reassignment of key personnel. And we'll need to do it without creating obvious patterns that would alert Moldavian intelligence to the fact that we've discovered their source. There's something else, Isabella said quietly. My handler mentioned that they have other assets in Valdoria. I don't know who they are or what positions they hold, but I'm not the only Moldavian intelligence operative in your country. The revelation hit both men like a physical blow. Bad enough that the Queen Consort had been feeding information to enemy agents. Worse still to realize that Moldavian intelligence had built an entire network of assets throughout Valdorian society. Do you have any information about these other operatives? William asked. Nothing specific, but based on the questions my handler asked, I suspect they have someone in the Defense Ministry with access to detailed military planning, and possibly someone in the Foreign Office who can provide advance notice of diplomatic initiatives. Charles stood and walked to the windows again, looking out at the peaceful gardens where tomorrow morning he might have to announce his abdication to preserve the monarchy's credibility. The betrayal by someone he trusted completely was devastating on a personal level, but the national security implications were potentially catastrophic. Isabella, he said without turning around, you mentioned that you wanted to find a way out before the situation escalated further. If we could guarantee your brother's safety and provide you both with protected status, would you be willing to cooperate fully with our counterintelligence efforts? You mean help you identify the other Moldavian assets? I mean help us turn this situation to our advantage. If your handlers believe you're still an active asset, We might be able to use that belief to feed them false information while we work to identify and neutralize their other operatives. William looked at his father with new respect, recognizing the strategic thinking that had made Charles an effective king despite the personal turmoil he was experiencing. Rather than simply reacting to betrayal with anger and punishment, he was considering how to transform a devastating security breach into an opportunity to strengthen Valdoria's position. That would be incredibly dangerous for Isabella, William pointed out. If Moldavian intelligence suspects she's been turned, they'll eliminate her immediately. I know, Isabella said quietly. But, Charles, if there's a chance I can help protect Valdoria from attack, if there's a way I can try to undo some of the damage I've caused, I'm willing to take that risk. Charles turned back to face them, and both Isabella and William could see that the king had made a decision that went beyond personal feelings or family considerations. We're going to need help from people with much more expertise in counterintelligence operations than any of us possess. But if there's a possibility of turning this situation around, we have to try. And the question of abdication? William asked. Charles looked at his son, then at his wife, then at the photographs that had started this entire devastating conversation. That decision may depend on whether we can resolve this crisis in a way that strengthens rather than weakens the monarchy's position. If we can expose and neutralize Moldavian intelligence operations while protecting Valdoria from attack, it might be possible for the crown to survive this scandal. And if we can't, then I'll abdicate immediately to preserve the institution and give you the chance to rebuild trust with the Valdorian people. Charles's voice carried the weight of absolute resolution. Whatever personal cost that requires, the monarchy must survive this crisis. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the private dining room, all three occupants understood that they had committed themselves to a dangerous game of deception and counterintelligence that would determine not just their personal fates, but the future security of their entire kingdom. The conversation that had begun with the revelation of betrayal was ending with the framework for what might become either the monarchy's salvation or its final chapter. The emergency meeting convened at dawn in the palace's most secure conference room, a windowless chamber 3 floors underground where the kingdom's most sensitive intelligence matters were discussed. Charles arrived first, having spent a sleepless night in his study rather than return to the bed he'd shared with Isabella. The documents spread across his desk had painted an increasingly dire picture of Valdoria's vulnerability to Moldavian intelligence penetration. Director Sarah Chun of Valdorian Intelligence entered precisely at 6 o'clock, her normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain after 18 hours of emergency analysis. Behind her came General Marcus Hoffman, the kingdom's defense minister, and Elena Vasquez, the foreign intelligence coordinator. All three wore the grim expressions of professionals who'd spent the night discovering how thoroughly their security apparatus had been compromised. Your Majesty, Director Chin began without preamble. Based on Queen Consort Isabella's debriefing and our subsequent investigation, we're dealing with what appears to be a sophisticated long-term intelligence operation that has penetrated multiple levels of government. William arrived as she spoke, carrying fresh intelligence reports and looking as exhausted as his father. We've identified at least 3 additional security breaches beyond Isabella's activities. Someone in the Defense Ministry has been copying classified documents for the past 14 months. Financial intelligence suggests unusual payments to someone in the Foreign Office. And there are communication patterns indicating a possible asset in the Royal Protection Service. Charles felt his remaining faith in the people around him crumble a bit more. Our own security service has been compromised. We're still investigating, but the evidence suggests someone with access to royal family movement schedules has been passing information to external contacts. General Hoffman opened a tablet and showed surveillance footage from the past week. Notice how Moldavian surveillance teams always seem to know exactly when and where royal family members would be traveling outside the palace. The implications were staggering. Not only had Moldavian intelligence gained access to military and diplomatic secrets, they'd also been tracking the movements of the royal family with precision that could only come from someone inside the protection detail. Charles realized that his life, William's life, and the lives of his other children had been at risk every time they left the palace grounds. How long do we have before they realize we've discovered their network? William asked. That depends partly on how well Isabella can maintain her cover, Director Chin replied. If she can continue to appear as a normal asset while actually working with us, we might have weeks to identify and neutralize their other operatives. But if they suspect she's been compromised, they'll likely activate all their assets immediately for maximum damage before extraction. Charles considered the impossible position Isabella had volunteered for. She would need to continue meeting with her Moldavian handlers, passing information that appeared valuable while actually serving Valdorian interests, all while knowing that discovery would mean immediate assassination. What kind of support can we provide her? Very limited, Your Majesty. Too much obvious protection would alert Moldavian intelligence that her status has changed. She'll need to operate essentially alone while under constant surveillance by people who will kill her without hesitation if they suspect betrayal. The door opened to admit Isabella herself, dressed in simple black clothing and carrying a briefcase that Director Chun had provided the previous evening. Her transformation from queen consort to intelligence operative was startling. She moved with professional efficiency, her expression calm and analytical rather than emotional. "My handler wants to meet this afternoon," she announced without greeting. "Viktor Petrov contacted me 2 hours ago through the usual encrypted channel. He's demanding a complete briefing on Valdoria's response to increased Moldavian military activity along the border." "What will you tell him?" General Hoffman asked. Isabella opened her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder identical to dozens Charles had seen her review during their marriage. "Director Chun and I prepared a briefing that includes accurate but outdated information about defensive positions, along with false intelligence about planned troop movements and supply schedules." Charles studied the documents, recognizing the careful balance of truth and deception required for effective counterintelligence. The information would satisfy Petrov's expectations while actually strengthening Valdorian defensive positions by misleading Moldavian military planners. "There's something else," Isabella continued. "Petrov mentioned that their timeline has been accelerated. Whatever military action they're planning may happen within the next week rather than the several months we initially estimated." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. Instead of having weeks or months to identify and neutralize Moldavian assets, they might have only days before facing a coordinated attack supported by detailed intelligence about Valdorian vulnerabilities. "General Hoffman, what's our readiness status?" Charles asked. "We've implemented emergency security protocols based on Isabella's information about compromised positions and schedules. Border patrols have been reorganized, supply depots relocated, and communication systems updated. But if Moldavia launches a coordinated assault using intelligence from their other assets, our defensive capabilities could still be overwhelmed." William spread a map of the eastern border region across the conference table. "If we assume they have current intelligence about our defensive positions, where would you expect them to concentrate their attack?" Isabella studied the map with the professional competence of someone who'd spent years analyzing military intelligence. "Based on the questions my handler asked, I think they're planning simultaneous strikes here, here, and here." She pointed to 3 border crossings that would allow rapid penetration into Valdorian territory. These positions would give them control of the main highway connecting our eastern provinces to the capital, cutting off reinforcements and supply lines. General Hoffman noted grimly. "Classic invasion strategy. If they can establish control of those positions and hold them for even 48 hours, they could create facts on the ground that would be difficult to reverse." Charles felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders. The personal betrayal by his wife had evolved into a national security crisis that could determine whether Valdoria remained an independent kingdom or fell under Moldavian control. Every decision made in this room would affect millions of lives. "Director Chun, what assets do we have for identifying their other operatives?" "Limited options, Your Majesty. We can increase surveillance on suspected individuals, but if we move too aggressively, we risk alerting their handlers that we're aware of the network. Our best chance is to use Isabella's position to gather intelligence about their other assets while feeding false information about our defensive preparations." Isabella closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. "There might be another option. During my years working with Moldavian intelligence, I learned about their operational protocols and security procedures. If I can convince my handler that I need to coordinate with other assets for this accelerated timeline, he might give me information about who they are and how to contact them." "That's extremely dangerous," William pointed out. "It would require you to demonstrate much more operational knowledge than a simple intelligence source should possess." "I can handle it. I'll tell Petrov that Heinrich Volkov taught me about operational security during our meetings, and that I'm concerned about maintaining coordination now that the timeline has been accelerated." Isabella's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent years managing complex deceptions. Petrov knows that Volkov was experienced in intelligence operations, so it would be believable that he'd share operational knowledge with someone he was trying to recruit. Charles studied his wife's face, looking for signs of the emotional woman who'd confessed her betrayal yesterday afternoon. What he saw instead was a professional intelligence operative who'd found a way to apply her skills in service of the country she'd grown to genuinely care about. The transformation was impressive and slightly unsettling. If you can identify their other assets, what's our plan for neutralizing them without alerting Moldavian intelligence to what we've discovered? He asked Director Chun. Carefully coordinated arrests during the next 48 hours, timed to coincide with Isabella feeding false intelligence about our defensive preparations. If we can convince Moldavian military planners that our forces are positioned differently than they actually are, we might be able to turn their invasion attempt into a catastrophic failure. General Hoffman activated a wall-mounted display showing real-time positioning of Valdorian forces along the eastern border. We've already begun repositioning units based on Isabella's intelligence about compromised locations. If we can mislead them about our actual defensive arrangements while simultaneously removing their intelligence sources, we'll have significant tactical advantages. The political implications, William reminded them. Even if we successfully defend against Moldavian attack and expose their intelligence network, the scandal of the Queen Consort's involvement will still threaten the monarchy's stability. Charles had been considering this problem throughout the night. That depends on how we present the resolution to the Valdorian people. If Isabella's role can be portrayed as instrumental in exposing and defeating a serious threat to national security, the public reaction might be very different than if she's simply seen as a foreign agent who was caught. You're talking about rehabilitating her reputation, Director Chin observed, transforming her from liability to asset in the public perception. I'm talking about telling the truth, Charles replied. Isabella made serious mistakes that threatened our national security. But she also took enormous personal risks to help us identify and neutralize those threats before they could cause irreparable damage. Both aspects of her story deserve to be known. Isabella looked at Charles with an expression he couldn't quite read. Charles, you don't have to protect my reputation. If exposing everything about my activities helps preserve the monarchy's credibility, that's more important than what people think about me personally. It's not about protecting your reputation, Isabella. It's about accurately representing what actually happened so the Valdorian people can make informed judgments about their government and their royal family. Charles's voice carried the authority of someone who'd made a fundamental decision about his responsibilities as king. We're going to handle this crisis with complete transparency, whatever the political consequences. Director Chin made notes on her tablet as she outlined the operational timeline. Isabella meets with Petrov this afternoon and attempts to gather intelligence about other assets. Based on what she learns, we coordinate simultaneous arrests tomorrow morning while feeding false defensive information through the compromised channels. General Hoffman's forces implement final defensive preparations tomorrow evening, ready for potential Moldavian assault beginning Wednesday. And if the plan fails? William asked. If Moldavian intelligence realizes we've turned their network and launches immediate attack with accurate intelligence about our actual positions? Charles stood and moved to the wall map showing Valdoria's eastern provinces. Small towns and agricultural communities dotted the region that would bear the brunt of any military assault. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens live their daily lives trusting that their government would protect them from foreign threats. If the plan fails, we defend our people with everything we have and accept whatever political consequences follow, he said. But I believe this plan will succeed because we have advantages Moldavian intelligence doesn't expect us to have. What advantages? General Hoffman asked. They believe they control our intelligence sources, so they don't expect us to have accurate information about their operations. They believe their network is secure, so they don't expect coordinated counterintelligence activities. And, most importantly, they believe Isabella is still a loyal asset, so they don't expect the false intelligence we're about to feed them. Isabella checked her watch and gathered her materials. I need to leave for my meeting with Petrov in 2 hours. Are there any specific pieces of information you want me to try to obtain? Director Chin consulted her notes. Confirmation of attack timing, identification of other assets if possible, and any intelligence about their extraction plans for operatives after the attack begins. Extraction plans? If Moldavia is planning military action, they'll want to evacuate their intelligence assets before the situation becomes chaotic. Learning about those plans might help us understand their operational timeline and priorities. As the meeting concluded and participants dispersed to their various preparations, Charles found himself alone with Isabella for the second time since her confession. The woman who'd entered the conference room as a professional operative preparing for a dangerous mission was his wife again, showing traces of the vulnerability and uncertainty that had characterized their private conversations during their marriage. Charles, I want you to know that whatever happens this afternoon, whatever happens in the next few days, I understand that this is probably the end of our marriage. He considered her words carefully, recognizing the truth behind them. Even if Isabella successfully helped expose and defeat the Moldavian intelligence network, even if her actions ultimately strengthened rather than weakened Valdorian security, the foundation of trust that marriage required had been irreparably damaged. Isabella, right now I can't think beyond the next 48 hours. But I want you to know that regardless of what the future holds for us personally, I'm proud of the courage you're showing in trying to undo the damage your earlier actions caused. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to understand that every classified briefing you shared with me, every strategic discussion we had over dinner, every moment when you trusted me with information that could affect national security, those were the most difficult parts of my assignment because they reminded me constantly of what I was betraying. Charles studied her face, looking for traces of the deception that had characterized their entire relationship, but found only exhausted honesty. The irony is that if you'd told me the truth about your situation when we first met, I might have found a way to help you without compromising Valdorian security. I've always believed that people forced into impossible circumstances deserve compassion and assistance. I was too afraid of losing you to risk telling you the truth. And by the time I realized how much I loved you and how much I wanted our marriage to be real, I was in too deep to see any way out. Isabella gathered her materials and moved toward the door, preparing to leave for what might be the most dangerous meeting of her life. Charles watched her go, torn between admiration for her current courage and grief for everything their relationship had been built on lies. Isabella, he called as she reached the door. Yes. Come back safely. Whatever else has happened between us, Valdoria needs you to complete this mission successfully. She nodded once and left, leaving Charles alone with maps and intelligence reports that would determine whether his kingdom survived the next week intact. For the first time since ascending to the throne, he felt fully prepared to bear the weight of absolute responsibility for his people's welfare, whatever personal cost that demanded. The abandoned warehouse on Valenhall's industrial outskirts had been carefully chosen for its anonymity and multiple exit routes. Isabella arrived 30 minutes early, as she'd been trained to do, and conducted a thorough surveillance check of the surrounding area. Old habits from her years as an active operative came flooding back. The careful positioning to observe all approaches, the mental cataloging of potential weapons and escape routes, the controlled breathing that kept her heart rate steady despite the enormous stakes. Viktor Petrov appeared precisely at the agreed time, emerging from the shadows between shipping containers with the silent movement of someone who'd spent decades avoiding detection. At 55, he retained the lean efficiency of a career intelligence officer, his gray hair and unremarkable features allowing him to blend invisibly into any crowd. Isabella had worked with him for 3 years, but, looking at him now, she realized how little she actually knew about the man who'd held her brother's life as leverage for her cooperation. Isabella, you look troubled, Petrov observed in accented English as he approached the metal table where she'd arranged her briefing materials. The accelerated timeline is creating stress for all of us, but especially for assets who haven't been trained for rapid operational transitions. His comment provided the perfect opening for her strategy. Victor, I need to discuss operational security concerns. Heinrich Volkov spent considerable time explaining how intelligence networks maintain coordination during crisis periods, and I'm worried about maintaining effectiveness if we're not properly synchronized. Petrov's eyes sharpened with interest. Volkov discussed operational procedures with you? That's unusual for someone at his level to share such information with a developmental asset. He said the accelerated timeline meant traditional compartmentalization might need to be relaxed to ensure mission success. Isabella kept her voice steady, projecting the nervousness of someone concerned about professional competence rather than someone actively committing counterintelligence. He mentioned that other assets in the network would need to coordinate more closely, and that I should understand how to maintain contact if normal channels were compromised. For several moments, Petrov studied her face with the analytical intensity of someone trained to detect deception. Isabella forced herself to maintain the slightly anxious expression of an amateur operative worried about making mistakes, while internally cataloging every detail of his reaction for later analysis. Volkov was correct that operational security requirements change during crisis periods, Petrov finally said. But his information may have been outdated. Our network structure has evolved significantly since his last direct involvement with Moldavian intelligence. Isabella opened her briefcase and withdrew the carefully prepared intelligence packet about Valdorian defensive positions. I have the information you requested about military responses to increased border activity. But, Victor, I'm concerned about accuracy if other assets are providing conflicting intelligence without proper coordination. Show me what you have, Petrov said, accepting the documents while continuing to evaluate her demeanor for signs of compromise. As he reviewed the false intelligence about Valdorian troop positions and supply schedules, Isabella watched his reactions carefully. His professional satisfaction with apparently valuable information was obvious, but she also noted his unconscious nodding at specific details that suggested he was cross-referencing her reports with intelligence from other sources. This intelligence confirms information we've received from other channels, he said approvingly. Your access to King Charles's strategic planning continues to provide invaluable insights. Isabella seized the opening. That's exactly my concern, Victor. If multiple assets are reporting similar information, doesn't that increase the risk of detection? Heinrich suggested that overlapping coverage could create patterns that counterintelligence services might notice. Petrov closed the intelligence packet and leaned back in his metal chair. Your concern demonstrates growing operational sophistication. Yes, overlapping intelligence streams do create security risks, which is why we've implemented careful coordination protocols. Could you explain how those work? Volkov mentioned that assets should understand the overall network structure in case emergency communication becomes necessary. Isabella held her breath, knowing that her next few moments would determine whether she gained the intelligence director she needed or exposed herself as a turned asset. Petrov's response would reveal either critical information about Moldavian operatives in Valdoria or confirm his suspicion that she was no longer working for his service. Heinrich's information was partially correct but incomplete, Petrov said after a long pause. We do maintain coordination between assets, but through carefully controlled channels that prevent any single operative from knowing the complete network structure. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small encrypted communication device. However, given the accelerated operational timeline, emergency coordination protocols are now in effect. You'll need this device to receive priority communications during the next 72 hours. Isabella accepted the device while her mind raced through the implications. If Petrov was providing her with emergency communication equipment, it suggested either that he still trusted her completely or that Moldavian intelligence was preparing for immediate action that would make long-term asset protection irrelevant. How many other assets will be using similar devices? That information is compartmentalized for security reasons. But you should know that emergency coordination may involve contact from operatives you haven't previously worked with directly. Petrov's expression grew more serious. Isabella, the next 72 hours will determine whether our long-term investment in this network produces the strategic advantages our government expects. The phrasing confirmed Isabella's worst fears about Moldavian timeline expectations. You're talking about military action within the next 3 days. I'm talking about a complete reorganization of regional power structures that will require every asset to perform at maximum effectiveness. Petrov stood and moved to the warehouse window, scanning the industrial landscape for signs of surveillance. Your intelligence about Valdorian defensive vulnerabilities has been crucial in finalizing operational planning. If your reports are accurate, Moldavian forces should be able to establish permanent footholds in eastern Valdoria before effective resistance can be organized. Isabella felt sick as she realized the full scope of damage her earlier intelligence had enabled. Even though she tried to limit the information she provided, her reports about Valdorian military capabilities had apparently been detailed enough to support invasion planning that could succeed. Victor, what happens to network assets if military operations don't proceed as planned? Extraction protocols are in place for essential personnel. But, Isabella, you should understand that your position as queen consort makes you far too valuable to extract unless absolutely necessary. Your continued access to Valdorian strategic planning will be crucial during any transitional period. The implications were clear. Moldavian intelligence expected her to remain in position during and after military action, continuing to provide intelligence about Valdorian government responses to occupation or territorial losses. She would be expected to spy on her husband's efforts to defend his kingdom and his people. "I understand," she said, while mentally noting every detail of the conversation for her debriefing with Director Chun. Petrov returned to the table and gathered his materials. "You'll receive priority communications beginning tomorrow morning. Emergency coordination protocols mean you may be contacted directly by other assets if circumstances require immediate intelligence sharing." Isabella realized this might be her only opportunity to gain information about other network operatives. Should I prepare specific types of intelligence that would be most useful for coordination purposes? Focus on real-time information about government crisis response, military communication protocols, and royal family security arrangements. Other assets will provide complementary intelligence about specific tactical vulnerabilities. The casual mention of royal family security arrangements sent a chill through Isabella as she realized that Moldavian intelligence wasn't just planning military action against Valdorian territory. They were also considering direct action against the monarchy itself. "Victor, are there specific security concerns I should be aware of? Your personal security remains our priority, but the dynamic situation may require rapid operational adjustments. The communication device includes emergency extraction signals if your position becomes compromised." As the meeting concluded and both participants prepared to leave through separate exits, Isabella felt the weight of everything she'd learned. Moldavian military action was planned for the next 72 hours. Their intelligence network included assets she hadn't previously known about, and their operational goals extended beyond territorial gains to include destabilization or elimination of Valdorian government leadership. The encrypted communication device in her pocket represented either an opportunity to gain real-time intelligence about Moldavian operations or a sophisticated test of her loyalty that could expose her as a turned asset. Either way, the next 3 days would determine whether Valdoria survived as an independent kingdom. Driving back toward the palace through Valenhall's evening traffic, Isabella used surveillance detection techniques to confirm she wasn't being followed while her mind processed the operational intelligence she'd gathered. The false information she'd provided about Valdorian defensive positions would hopefully mislead Moldavian attack planning. But the timeline was much shorter than anyone had anticipated. Her encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Director Chun requesting immediate debriefing. Isabella replied with a coded confirmation while calculating how much time remained before Moldavian forces would begin moving toward their attack positions. The palace appeared normal as she approached through the main gates, but Isabella's trained eye noticed subtle changes that indicated heightened security measures. Additional guards at checkpoint positions, modified patrol routes, and the discreet positioning of counterintelligence personnel throughout the grounds. Valdoria was preparing for war while trying to maintain the appearance of normal royal operations. Charles was waiting in the secure conference room when she arrived, along with Director Chun, General Hoffman, and Prince William. All four looked as if they'd spent the previous hours planning for scenarios none of them had ever hoped to face. Victor confirmed that military action is planned within the next 72 hours, Isabella announced without preamble. Moldavian forces expect to establish permanent territorial control based partly on intelligence I've provided about defensive vulnerabilities. How permanent? General Hoffman asked grimly. Victor spoke about complete reorganization of regional power structures. This isn't a limited border incursion. They're planning occupation of eastern Valdoria as a foundation for broader territorial expansion. Director Chin activated recording equipment as Isabella provided detailed briefing about her conversation with Petrov. The encrypted communication device was immediately turned over to technical analysts who would attempt to monitor Moldavian network communications without revealing that they'd gained access to the system. The most immediate concern is the threat to royal family security, Isabella continued. Victor specifically mentioned intelligence requirements about royal family security arrangements, suggesting they're considering direct action against government leadership. Charles felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders as he processed the implications. Not only were Moldavian forces preparing to invade his kingdom, they were also planning to eliminate or capture members of the royal family to prevent organized resistance to occupation. General Hoffman, what's our defensive readiness based on this updated timeline? We can implement final defensive preparations within 24 hours, but we'll need to accelerate everything we'd planned for gradual implementation. Hoffman consulted his tablet. The advantage is that if we're ready for immediate action and they're expecting to face defenses positioned according to Isabella's false intelligence, we should be able to inflict significant casualties on their initial assault forces. William studied the wall map showing current positions of Valdorian forces. What about the other assets in their network? If they're planning to contact Isabella directly for coordination, we might be able to identify them in real time. Director Chen nodded. Technical analysis of the communication device should allow us to monitor network traffic and identify other operatives when they make contact. But we'll need to balance intelligence gathering against the risk of Isabella's exposure as a turned asset. Isabella looked around the room at the 4 people whose lives and futures depended on decisions made in the next few hours. There's something else. Victor mentioned that my position makes me too valuable to extract unless absolutely necessary. They expect me to remain operational during and after military action, continuing to provide intelligence about government responses to occupation. Which means they can't afford to suspect your loyalty until after their military objectives are achieved, Charles observed. That gives us operational advantages, but also puts you in extreme personal danger for an extended period. Charles, I understand the risks. But this might be our best opportunity to gain real-time intelligence about their operations while feeding false information that could save thousands of Valdorian lives. For a moment, the conference room fell silent as each person contemplated the enormity of what they were planning. Isabella would continue operating as a double agent during active military conflict, providing intelligence that could determine whether Valdoria maintained its independence or fell under foreign occupation. Director Chen, what support can we provide without compromising her cover? Charles asked. Very limited direct protection, but we can position rapid response teams throughout the capital and maintain constant monitoring of her location through technical means. Chen paused, clearly reluctant to continue. Your Majesty, I need to point out that if Moldavian forces achieve their initial objectives despite our preparations, Isabella's position will become untenable regardless of her cover status. Charles nodded grimly. If Moldavian invasion succeeded, Isabella would face execution either as a turned asset if her true loyalties were discovered, or as a member of the royal family if Moldavian forces eliminated government leadership as planned. Isabella, he said quietly, you can still choose extraction from this situation. We have enough intelligence now to prepare our defenses, and asking you to continue operating under these circumstances goes beyond any reasonable expectations. Isabella looked directly at her husband, and for a moment the professional operative disappeared, replaced by the woman who'd genuinely fallen in love with a king and his kingdom. Charles, 3 years ago I came to Valdoria to betray everything you care about. If I can help save those same things now, that's not a sacrifice. It's an opportunity to finally deserve the life I found here. As the meeting concluded with final operational preparations, all 5 participants understood that the next 72 hours would determine whether their carefully planned counterintelligence operation succeeded in protecting Valdoria or whether the kingdom would fall to an invasion enabled partly by the woman who was now risking everything to prevent it. The encrypted communication device buzzed at 3:47 in the morning, jolting Isabella from the restless sleep she'd finally achieved after hours of staring at the ceiling. The message was brief and coded, but its meaning was unmistakable. Moldavian forces were beginning their advance toward Valdorian borders, and network assets were expected to provide real-time intelligence about defensive responses. She slipped quietly from the bed she'd shared with Charles for the last time, knowing that regardless of how the next 24 hours unfolded, their marriage as she'd known it was ending. Charles lay still in the darkness, but his breathing told her he wasn't asleep either. Neither spoke as she gathered the materials she'd prepared for what Director Chun had grimly termed active operations. The palace corridors were different in the pre-dawn hours, filled with the controlled urgency of a government preparing for war while maintaining the appearance of normal royal routine. Isabella passed guards who nodded respectfully at the queen consort, unaware that she was moving toward meetings that would determine whether they'd be defending an independent kingdom or fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. The secure communications center 3 floors below the main palace had been transformed into a war room, where Director Chun coordinated the most complex counterintelligence operation in Valdorian history. Large displays showed real-time positions of both Valdorian and Moldavian forces, while banks of monitoring equipment tracked communications throughout the region. They're moving faster than we anticipated, Chen reported as Isabella arrived. Moldavian forces began advancing at 2:30, which suggests they're confident about their intelligence regarding our defensive positions. Isabella studied the tactical displays, recognizing the attack patterns Petrov had hinted at during their meeting. They're concentrating on exactly the border crossings I identified yesterday. If they're following intelligence I provided 6 months ago, they'll expect to find our main defensive positions here, and here. General Hoffman activated a secure communication channel to his field commanders. Confirmed. Enemy forces are advancing directly toward positions that were abandoned and relocated based on Isabella's intelligence. They're walking into carefully prepared kill zones instead of the vulnerable defensive lines they expect to find. The first test of their counterintelligence operation was succeeding, but Isabella knew that Moldavian intelligence would quickly realize their attack plans were based on false information. Her role as a double agent was about to become exponentially more dangerous. Victor's expecting real-time reports about Valdorian defensive responses, she told Chun. What intelligence do you want me to provide? Panic and confusion. Reports of government leadership struggling to coordinate effective responses, military communications breaking down under pressure, royal family preparing for possible evacuation. Chun handed Isabella a carefully prepared intelligence packet. Make it appear that our defensive preparations are failing and that Moldavian forces are achieving their strategic objectives. Isabella reviewed the false information, noting how skillfully it balanced believable details with intelligence that would encourage Moldavian forces to continue advancing into what were actually well-prepared defensive positions. This should keep them committed to their current attack plan for at least 6 to 8 hours. Long enough for us to inflict decisive casualties and capture key personnel who can provide intelligence about their broader strategic plans, General Hoffman confirmed. The encrypted device buzzed again with a priority message from Petrov demanding immediate intelligence about royal family security arrangements. Isabella felt her stomach tighten as she realized that Moldavian forces weren't just planning to occupy territory. They intended to eliminate government leadership to prevent organized resistance. They want current information about royal family locations and security protocols, she told Chun. This confirms they're planning direct action against monarchy leadership. Director Chun activated emergency protocols that would immediately relocate all royal family members to hardened security positions throughout the kingdom. King Charles is remaining in the palace to maintain government coordination, but his other children are being moved to secure locations as of this moment. Isabella typed careful responses to Petrov's demands, providing intelligence that would suggest the royal family was vulnerable to capture while actually misdirecting Moldavian assault teams toward positions where they would face concentrated defensive fire. Each piece of false information she transmitted felt like a small betrayal of the people who trusted her, even though she now served their interests. By 6 o'clock in the morning, reports from the eastern border confirmed that Moldavian forces had suffered significant casualties during their initial assault on what they'd expected to be lightly defended positions. But Isabella's communication device indicated that Moldavian intelligence was beginning to suspect their information might be compromised. Victor's asking for verification of intelligence from other network assets, she reported to Chun. He wants confirmation that Valdorian defenses are actually as weak as my reports suggest, which means other assets in their network are providing intelligence that contradicts what you're telling them, Chun replied grimly. They're starting to piece together that something is wrong with their information. The secure communications center fell silent except for the constant chatter of military radio traffic as everyone processed the implications. If Moldavian intelligence realized their network had been compromised, they would immediately assume Isabella had been turned and take action to eliminate her. But they might also shift to alternative attack plans that Valdorian forces weren't prepared to defend against. How long before they definitively conclude their intelligence is false? Isabella asked. Based on battle damage reports and tactical observations, probably 2 to 3 hours, General Hoffman estimated. After that, they'll either withdraw to reorganize with better intelligence or commit to their attack, despite knowing their initial planning was flawed. Isabella's device buzzed with an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. Petrov was requesting immediate face-to-face meeting at a new location, with emergency extraction protocols in effect. The message was either a final test of her loyalty or confirmation that Moldavian intelligence had identified her as a compromised asset. They want direct contact within the next hour, she told Shin. Either they still trust me and need urgent intelligence, or they've decided I'm blown and are planning to eliminate me. Director Chen studied tactical displays showing the rapidly evolving situation along Valdoria's eastern border. Moldavian forces had committed significant resources to their initial attack plan, and even though they were suffering casualties, they retained enough strength to potentially overwhelm Valdorian defenses if they adapted their strategy effectively. Isabella, if you meet with Petrov now, there's a significant chance you won't survive the encounter. But if you don't meet with him, he'll definitely know you've been turned, and they'll assume all their intelligence has been compromised. What's the strategic value of my continuing the deception for another few hours? If you can convince them that Valdorian defenses are collapsing and that royal family members are vulnerable to capture, they might commit their reserve forces to objectives that would leave their primary assault formations exposed to counterattack. Isabella considered the choice between personal survival and the possibility of delivering decisive intelligence that could end Moldavian invasion attempts permanently. The woman who'd spent 3 years as queen consort might have chosen safety, but the professional operative she'd once been understood the strategic importance of maintaining her cover as long as possible. I'll meet with Petrov, but I want extraction protocols in place if the situation becomes untenable. Rapid response teams will be positioned throughout the area, but, Isabella, if Moldavian intelligence has decided you're compromised, we may not be able to reach you in time. Charles appeared in the communications center as Isabella prepared for what might be her final meeting with Viktor Petrov. Despite the demands of coordinating national defense, he'd insisted on seeing her before she left the palace. Isabella, you don't have to do this. We have enough intelligence now to continue defensive operations without requiring you to take additional risks. She looked at her husband, seeing both the king who had to make impossible decisions about national survival and the man who genuinely loved her despite everything she'd done to betray that love. Charles, 6 months ago, I gave Moldavian intelligence everything they needed to plan a successful invasion of your kingdom. If I can help defeat that invasion now, it's not additional risk. It's the completion of work I should have done years ago. And after today, assuming we both survive what's coming, what happens to us? Isabella had been avoiding this question since her confession 3 days ago, but standing in the communications center surrounded by evidence of war her earlier actions had helped precipitate, she finally had clarity about their future. Charles, I'll always love you, and I'll always be grateful for the years when I was genuinely happy as your wife. But even if you could forgive everything I've done, I don't think I could forgive myself enough to rebuild a marriage based on trust. You deserve better than a wife who has to prove her loyalty every day for the rest of her life. Charles nodded, accepting what he'd already concluded during his sleepless night. After this crisis is resolved, we'll announce that you're returning to private life for personal reasons. No scandal, no public recriminations. You'll be provided with security and financial support to begin whatever new life you choose. And the monarchy will survive because sometimes institutions are stronger than the people who serve them temporarily. Charles's voice carried the authority of someone who'd accepted absolute responsibility for his kingdom's future. William will make a better king than I have, partly because he'll have learned from watching how I handled this crisis. As Isabella prepared to leave for her meeting with Petrov, she realized that despite everything that had happened, Charles was still protecting her in the only way he could. Even after betrayal and lies and the threat of war, he was ensuring she would have the chance to build an honest life somewhere beyond the reach of either Moldavian intelligence or Valdorian justice. The meeting location Petrov had specified was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the capital, isolated enough to provide security for sensitive conversations, but also ideal for eliminating compromised assets without witnesses. Isabella arrived with surveillance detection training from her years as an operative and emergency communication devices provided by Director Chen's technical team. Viktor Petrov was waiting inside the factory with 2 additional men Isabella didn't recognize. Their positioning and demeanor immediately told her this wasn't a routine intelligence meeting. She was facing a professional interrogation team prepared to use whatever methods necessary to determine her true loyalties. Isabella, we need to discuss some inconsistencies in recent intelligence reporting. Petrov began with the calm tone of someone completely in control of a dangerous situation. Isabella forced herself to project the nervous confusion of an amateur operative facing unexpected criticism rather than the professional alertness of someone who recognized an interrogation setup. What kind of inconsistencies? I've been providing exactly the intelligence you requested. According to field reports, Valdorian defensive positions aren't where your intelligence indicated they should be. Our assault teams encountered significant resistance at locations your reports described as lightly defended. One of the unknown men stepped closer, his hand resting near a concealed weapon. Either your access to King Charles's strategic planning has been compromised, or you've been providing false information deliberately. Isabella's mind raced through possible responses while she calculated distances to exits and evaluated the tactical situation. 3 professionally trained operatives in an isolated location meant her survival depended entirely on maintaining her cover story convincingly enough to create doubt about their suspicions. Victor, I can only report what Charles tells me during our private conversations. If Valdorian military commanders are implementing defensive strategies different from what he's discussing with me, that suggests he doesn't trust me with complete information anymore. Why would King Charles lose confidence in sharing strategic information with his wife? Isabella recognized the interrogation technique, questions designed to elicit responses that would either confirm her story or reveal inconsistencies that proved deception. Her years as an operative had included training in resisting exactly this type of professional questioning. Because Heinrich Volkov's attempts to recruit me created suspicion about my loyalty. Charles hasn't said anything directly, but I've noticed he's been more careful about discussing military matters when I'm present. Isabella allowed genuine anxiety to color her voice. Victor, I think my position as an intelligence asset may be compromised regardless of whether I've done anything wrong. For several minutes, Petrov studied her face with the analytical intensity of someone trained to detect deception under stress. Isabella maintained eye contact while projecting the fearful uncertainty of someone whose carefully constructed life was falling apart through no fault of her own. If your access to current intelligence has been limited, why didn't you report this change in your operational status? Because I was hoping the situation would improve, and because I was afraid you'd consider me a failed asset who needed to be eliminated. Isabella's voice carried genuine emotion, though not for the reasons Petrov assumed. Victor, I've spent 3 years building this life. I don't want to lose everything because of suspicions I can't control. One of the unknown operatives whispered something to Petrov in what sounded like Moldavian military dialect. Isabella caught fragments that suggested they'd received updated battle damage reports confirming significant casualties among their assault forces. Isabella, our military commanders need accurate real-time intelligence about Valdorian defensive capabilities. If you can't provide that intelligence, your value as an asset is limited regardless of your past contributions. Isabella saw an opportunity to shift the conversation toward intelligence she could actually provide while maintaining her cover. I may not have access to current military planning, but I do have information about government crisis management and royal family security that could be valuable for your commanders. What kind of information? Charles is struggling to coordinate effective responses to your invasion because he's been isolated from his most trusted military advisors by security concerns. The royal family is preparing for possible evacuation, but they're arguing about whether to leave the kingdom or remain to maintain government continuity. Isabella provided carefully crafted intelligence that painted a picture of government confusion and royal family vulnerability, while actually describing security protocols designed to protect leadership during exactly the crisis they were facing. Petrov made notes as she spoke, and Isabella could see him weighing the value of her intelligence against the risks of continuing to operate a potentially compromised asset. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine whether she survived long enough to complete her mission. This intelligence is valuable if accurate. But, Isabella, you need to understand that your position is now extremely precarious. Any additional inconsistencies between your reports and battlefield realities will result in immediate termination of your operational status. The euphemism was clear. One more piece of false intelligence would mean her execution. Isabella nodded with the appropriate level of fear while mentally noting that her mission was entering its final phase. Victor, I understand the stakes. Is there specific intelligence your commanders need immediately to support current operations? Real-time locations of royal family members, and details about evacuation routes they might use to escape the capital. Petrov's expression made clear that this information would be used for capture or elimination operations. If government leadership can be neutralized quickly, organized resistance to occupation will collapse. Isabella felt sick as she realized the full scope of Moldavian objectives, but she provided carefully false intelligence about royal family movements that would send assassination teams toward heavily defended positions where they would face elite security units. The meeting concluded with Petrov providing new communication protocols for what he termed final operational phase activities. Isabella's role would be to monitor government responses to military defeats and report immediately if royal family members attempted to flee the kingdom. As she drove back toward the palace through streets where citizens went about their morning routines unaware that their kingdom was fighting for survival, Isabella used secure communication devices to report everything she'd learned to Director Chun. Moldavian forces were preparing for a final assault designed to capture strategic positions and eliminate government leadership, but their plans were based on false intelligence that would lead them into carefully prepared defensive positions. The palace was transformed when she arrived, with emergency command centers established in reinforced underground facilities and communication systems linking royal leadership with military commanders throughout the kingdom. Charles was coordinating national defense from a secure bunker while maintaining the public appearance of normal royal operations. Their final assault begins in approximately 4 hours, Isabella reported to the emergency command team. They're planning simultaneous strikes against government facilities and attempts to capture or eliminate royal family members. General Hoffman studied updated tactical displays showing Moldavian force movements. They're positioning exactly as Isabella's false intelligence suggested they would. If our defensive preparations are effective, this assault should exhaust their remaining offensive capabilities. Director Chun activated communication channels to rapid response teams positioned throughout the capital. All units, prepare for coordinated enemy action against government facilities beginning approximately 1400 hours. Royal Protection Details, implement emergency protocols for high-value target security. As afternoon approached, and radio reports confirmed that Moldavian forces were advancing toward their final assault positions, Isabella found herself alone with Charles in the command bunker, where he was monitoring the battle for his kingdom's survival. Whatever happens in the next few hours, I want you to know that watching you choose to risk everything to undo the damage your earlier actions caused has helped me understand why I fell in love with you in the first place, Charles said quietly. Isabella looked at the man she'd betrayed, and who was still finding ways to forgive her. Charles, I need you to promise me something. If Moldavian forces break through and reach this position, don't try to protect me. Your survival matters more than mine for Valdoria's future. Isabella, we're both going to survive this crisis, and we're both going to build new lives from the lessons we've learned. The first explosions echoed through the bunker as Moldavian assault teams began their coordinated attack on government facilities, unaware they were advancing into defensive positions prepared specifically to counter their strategic objectives. Isabella's intelligence work was entering its final test, determining whether her transformation from foreign agent to protector of Valdorian interests would succeed in preserving the kingdom she'd grown to love. Radio reports throughout the afternoon confirmed the success of their counterintelligence operation. Moldavian forces suffered decisive casualties while achieving none of their strategic objectives, and by evening their remaining units were withdrawing in disorder toward their own borders. 3 weeks later, King Charles announced his decision not to abdicate, having concluded that successfully defending the kingdom demonstrated the monarchy's effectiveness during national crises. Isabella quietly returned to private life under a new identity, protected by royal security but free to build an honest life away from both intelligence work and public scrutiny. Prince William remained heir apparent, but with new understanding of the complexities of leadership gained from watching his father handle an impossible situation with wisdom and courage. The monarchy survived stronger than before, having demonstrated its ability to protect Valdorian interests even when faced with betrayal and foreign invasion. The official history would record the crisis as a successful defense against foreign aggression. But those who lived through it understood that sometimes the greatest threats to kingdoms come from within, and sometimes the people who cause the most damage are also the ones who make the most important sacrifices to repair it.